My name is Silas Whitmore. I am 51 years old and I live in Nashville, Tennessee. And what I am going to share now is not a sermon, but a cry of warning that still makes my hands shake as I type. As you scroll through these lines, thousands of sincere Christians, people who loved God with all their strength and served faithfully in their church pews, are taking their last breath. They know the Bible from cover to cover, but many are discovering too late that a lifetime of religiosity is not a guaranteed passport to eternity. There is a sin that Jesus mentioned, something that condemns without exception, and the most terrifying thing is that it does not reside in what we do wrong, but in what we refuse to do right. For 23 years, I was the model of this spiritual success. I started from nothing, with only 11 people in my garage in 2001, and I saw that small group flourish into a congregation of more than 3,000 members in an imposing and modern building. I was a man consumed by the calling, or at least that is what I piously believed in those glory days. Before continuing, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any testimonies, and leave in the comments where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now let's get back to the testimony. I have always been a man of sacred routines and absolute dedication, coming from a lineage of deep faith where my father was a deacon and my mother had taught Sunday school for over 3 decades. I was ordained at age 28 in a Baptist church in Tennessee, bringing with me the background of 18 years as a high school history teacher. I shaped young minds during the day and spiritual hearts at night. My wife, Veronica, was always my safe harbor, a woman whose faith seemed unshakable as we raised our 4 children. Caleb, Naomi, Judah, and Phoebe. They all grew up under the lights of the altar, baptized early, active in missions and youth groups. I felt like the captain of a perfectly calibrated spiritual ship. My life was a succession of American history classes, school debates, and above all, the preaching of a gospel that I thought I understood in its entirety. However, behind all this impeccable family and ministerial structure, there was a silent vacuum that I couldn't even name. A gap that constant busyness masked perfectly. My schedule was a monument to ministerial efficiency, an endless cycle of presbytery meetings, marriage counseling, and deep Bible studies on the Book of Romans. I visited the sick, wrote a blog with tens of thousands of followers, and published books that were bestsellers in Christian bookstores. I was the spiritual father to a multitude and the counselor to other pastors who sought my theological wisdom. But on October 10th, 2024, everything I had built began to crumble under the weight of unbearable physical pain. For 2 weeks, I ignored a strange pressure in my chest, thinking it was just the stress of leading a megachurch or too much coffee. As a former marathon runner, I felt invincible, until in the middle of a sermon on God's faithfulness, I felt my chest explode. The pulpit, which had always been my place of authority, became my only support before my legs gave out, and the world spun into a total blackout in front of 800 shocked people. The chaos that followed is something I only know from the accounts of Veronica and the medical team, but the memory of the sharp pain before the void still haunts me. I was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center with a brutal diagnosis: severe coronary blockages and multiple clots. I needed emergency surgery or my heart would stop forever in a matter of minutes. Even in the face of imminent death, I felt an arrogant calm. After all, I was Silas Whitmore, the faithful pastor, the soul winner. I had the certainty of salvation etched into my mind by hundreds of sermons I had delivered myself. While my family cried and the church began a 24-hour vigil, I prepared for what I thought would be a glorious encounter. I remember the smell of antiseptic, Veronica's goodbye kiss, and the words of the anesthesiologist asking me to count down from 10. I reached 6. And then, what the medical team recorded as a 14-minute cardiac arrest became the experience that destroyed my entire theology. Clinical death was officially documented at 11:47 p.m. that night. While surgeons fought frantically with compressions, shocks, and massive doses of adrenaline, my heart was just an inert muscle. There were 14 minutes of absolute silence on the monitors. But for me, it was the entrance into a dimension that defies any human logic or conventional theological description. The first sensation was not one of heavenly peace, but of a silence so dense it seemed to erase the very concept of sound from existence. I was violently ripped from physical reality, as if existence itself were skin being forcibly removed. Suddenly, I was in a space that seemed infinite and suffocating at the same time, bathed in a light that had no source and surrounded by a darkness that could be seen. And there he was. But it wasn't the Jesus from the Sunday school paintings or the worship videos we projected at church. What I saw was a consuming fire, a being whose presence exuded a holiness so absolute that I instantly understood why the prophets fell as if dead before his face. His eyes burned with an intensity that pierced through millennia, an unbearable mixture of perfect justice and unfathomable love that made me tremble to the last atom of my immaterial being. Under that gaze, every mask I had carefully worn during 23 years of ministry simply disintegrated like ashes in the sun. All my polished rhetoric, the images of holiness I projected on the altar, and every self-deception I cultivated to feel superior to others, vanished instantly. I felt exposed in a way that physical nakedness could never describe. It wasn't my skin that was on display, but every hidden thought, every selfish motive behind my good works, and every moral compromise I silenced in the name of church growth. He said only my name, Silas. But in Jew's single word, I heard every second of my 51 years echo, every decision made in the darkness, every word spoken without love, and every action driven by pastoral vanity. It was a crushing weight to realize that before him, there was no resume or position that could protect me. The authority of that voice admitted no replies or justifications. It was the sound of absolute truth that I, ironically, preached every Sunday without ever having truly experienced in its rawest, most devastating, and transformative form, leaving me completely vulnerable before the Creator of all things. "Lord!" I cried out, or rather, my soul projected this plea as I collapsed forward, because for the first time in my life, I understood what that title meant in its totality. It wasn't a liturgical term, a catchphrase, or a song lyric, but the recognition of total sovereignty over everything I was and possessed. There was a sadness in his voice that seemed capable of shattering the universe itself as he said that, although I called him Lord with my lips, I never allowed him to truly be Lord over the area that mattered most to his kingdom. I felt a violent tremor and a desperate confusion take hold of me. I protested, trying to remind him that I served faithfully, that I built his church with sweat and tears, that I won thousands of souls and preached his word with a passion few had. I described my life as if I were presenting a report of goals achieved, desperately trying to use my service as a shield against the judgment I felt looming over me. But Jesus simply held out his hand and told me there was something I needed to see, a terrible secret hidden behind the walls of our temples and our incessant religious activities. The scenery around me transformed into a terrifying panoramic vision, as if millions of screens were projected simultaneously into my consciousness with absolute clarity. I saw endless crowds, millions of people dressed in their Sunday best, carrying worn Bibles and sporting expressions of deep devotion. They sang hymns I myself had led, raised their hands in passionate praise, and delivered eloquent sermons from pulpits around the world. They taught Bible studies, organized international missions, and fasted with rigor. It seemed like the final triumph of Christianity. But what happened next filled me with an indescribable dread that not even hell could explain. The ground beneath these devout crowds began to open, revealing not the lake of fire I described in my sermons, but an absolute void, an eternal nullity that represented total separation from the presence of God. Thousands of Christians began to fall into that abyss, still holding their Bibles, still singing their praises and crying, "Lord, Lord," while reciting biblical passages from memory. They fell into a frigid silence, lost in their own empty religiosity, devoid of any practical essence or real love. "Why?" I screamed in a desperation that seemed to tear my essence. "They believed in you. They served with everything they had, dedicated their entire lives to your work, lived devoutly, and made disciples in your name." I couldn't understand how those people, who seemed to be the pillar of faith in the world, could be swallowed by that eternal void. Jesus looked at me with a pain so deep it seemed to carry the entire weight of human suffering throughout history. He approached, and his voice, which now sounded like the roar of many waters, and at the same time a cutting whisper, penetrated to the core of my being. He told me to look closer, not at external appearances, but at what was pulsing inside each of those hearts. It was then that the images changed, and I began to see the naked truth behind the religious facades. I saw Pastor Theron Blackwell, from a megachurch in Phoenix, who preached about compassion every Sunday to 9,000 people. His sermons were heard by millions across the globe, but he drove his luxury car past the same homeless war veteran, sitting in his wheelchair with a cardboard sign, every single morning for 8 consecutive years, without ever stopping to actually help. It was 8 years of well-crafted excuses, totaling nearly 3,000 mornings where Pastor Theron saw Vernon's tired face and decided his schedule was too important for an interruption. He justified his indifference by saying he was late for crucial meetings, that the government should take care of it, or that it wasn't safe to stop in his gated community. While he moved crowds with words about the love of Christ, he denied that same love to the man God placed directly in his daily path. Right after, I saw Sister Winifred Ashford, a respected missions coordinator who organized trips to 7 different countries and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for international ministry. She was awarded and admired for her dedication to spreading the gospel around the world. But her own elderly mother languished in a nursing home just 18 kilometers away, struggling with dementia and pleading for a visit that rarely happened. Winifred appeared only at Christmas and Easter, claiming exhaustion from missionary work and a lack of time due to conferences on serving the forgotten, while her mother died alone on a cold Tuesday afternoon, with no one around to hold her hand in that final moment. The vision changed again to Deacon Orville Kendrick, a successful businessman and church treasurer in Portland, known for his impeccable integrity in managing millions in construction funds. He taught classes on financial stewardship and preached about generosity with a conviction that convinced anyone. Orville was prosperous and tithed every cent with mathematical precision, feeling proud of his financial faithfulness. However, when his co-worker of 12 years, Raymond, lost everything in a devastating fire that consumed his home and his dreams, Orville's response was a $50 gift card and a religious tract about trusting in God's plan. Raymond had helped Orville through his divorce, offering a shoulder and constant support. But when need knocked on Raymond's door, the man who preached about the kingdom of God offered only empty religious phrases and an amount that didn't even pay for one night in a hotel. I saw the grotesque contrast between the wealth accumulated by Orville and the absolute misery of his friend, and I realized that the heart of that deacon was as cold as the coins he counted with such zeal in the church treasury, totally indifferent to the pain of someone who shared bread and time with him daily. What destroyed me most was when I began to see faces I knew personally, people who sat in the pews of my own church, my ministry partners, and close friends. I saw Elder Beauregard Stanton, who led our outreach committee with an impressive strategic vision, organizing the collection of tons of food for local food banks. He was the face of public charity, but his own brother-in-law, Fletcher, lost his job and faced eviction with 3 small children to feed. Beauregard, who had just bought a $45,000 boat, lent Fletcher only $200 and rudely told him to get his life together. While Fletcher ended up living in a car with his family for 6 months, Beauregard posted smiling photos of vacations on the new boat, celebrating God's blessing on his social media. I saw Fletcher's despair and Beauregard's indifference, and the connection between the faith professed and the action practiced was completely broken. Dread took hold of me when I realized that these people were not isolated cases, but the reflection of a culture of convenience that I myself helped cultivate with my sermons focused on results and appearances, ignoring the suffering pulsing right under my nose. Then I saw our worship leader, Tallulah Briggs, whose heavenly voice led our congregation into the very presence of God every Sunday morning. I saw her at the altar, with tears streaming down her face, singing about God's miraculous provision and how He cares for every detail of our lives. The entire auditorium was in a trance with her delivery. However, the vision shifted to her neighbor, Mavis, an 83-year-old widow who lived next door. Mavis could barely pay for food with the little she received from Social Security, and she mentioned this constantly to Tallulah in quick conversations over the fence. Tallulah's response was always the same, a pious smile and a promise that she would be praying for her. But Tallulah never, in all those years, brought a bag of groceries to that lady. She never invited her to dinner, never offered practical help, only Christian platitudes and empty prayers while Mavis spent her time eating only one meal a day to make the money stretch until the end of the month. Tallulah's worship, which seemed so anointed on stage, was a discordant and offensive note in God's ears because it ignored the real hunger knocking at her door, and the silent cry of one who needed bread, not songs. Soon after, the face of Cornelius Drake, our youth pastor, appeared before me. Cornelius was dynamic, modern, and loved by teenagers. He spent hours mentoring young people, and many accepted Christ through his ministry. But there was a boy in the group named Emmett, whose family was going through a severe financial crisis. Emmett wore the same 3 outfits in constant rotation and never had money to participate in the youth group's extra activities. Cornelius knew Emmett's father had been fired, but instead of mobilizing the church or using his own resources, he made subtle jokes about Emmett's clothes in front of the other youths, calling it character building. He preached about the radical love of Jesus while silently humiliating a boy who desperately needed a helping hand and protection. I saw the pain in Emmett's eyes and the pride in Cornelius's heart, and I realized that the youth ministry, which I praised so much in our annual reports, was a facade of popularity built on the deliberate neglect of a wounded soul crying out for practical help, and not just motivational sermons that didn't fill the stomach or restore dignity. But they are true believers, I protested in a cry of absolute despair, feeling the ground of my theology collapse completely. They love your word, serve faithfully every day, and make disciples in your name. How can they be discarded this way? Jesus then spoke, and every syllable was like a blade of fire piercing the marrow of my soul, quoting his own words recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. He reminded me of the moment when the Son of Man comes in his glory and separates the people as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, echoed in my being. He explained with terrifying clarity that when he was hungry, they gave him no food. When he was thirsty, they gave him no drink. When he was a stranger, naked, sick, or in prison, they did not visit or welcome him. Silas. Matthew 25 is not a distant parable. It is not purely symbolic language, and it is not intended only for unbelievers, he said. It is the real and definitive standard of judgment for every person who claims to follow in my footsteps. And it is here that most of you are failing miserably while zealously taking care of your religious programs. My voice broke completely as I argued that everyone around us has needs and that it was impossible to help every person we met. No one can meet every need in the world, Lord, I said, shaking violently under the weight of his glorious presence. Jesus moved even closer, and his proximity was a mixture of glory and terror that I could not bear. He told me that the problem was not the inability to help, but the deliberate refusal to do so. They saw the need clearly, had the resources readily available, and felt the conviction of the Holy Spirit in their hearts, but they chose comfort over compassion. They chose the convenience of their own agendas over radical obedience to my commandments. They justified their refusal with elaborate theological excuses, saying they already tithed to the church or that the government should take care of the social aspect. They created complex reasoning to avoid the simple and devastating truth. When you see someone in genuine need and have the power to help, you help. Not because it buys your salvation, but because real, living faith always produces real, tangible action. And anything less than that is just a religious performance that ends in eternal death. Now, Silas, look into your own heart, Jesus said, and those words were like a scalpel of light cutting through the last layers of my soul. In the next instant, a face appeared before me with a clarity that left me breathless, a face I had trained my eyes to ignore for more than a decade. It was the face of Marcus Dalton, a 62-year-old man, a Vietnam veteran, who had lived on the streets for 11 years. From 2012 until that moment in 2024, Marcus sat in exactly the same spot every Sunday morning, right in front of the main entrance to my church, in his worn wheelchair, holding a cardboard sign that asked only for a chance. You saw him 624 times, Jesus said softly, and each number hammered into my conscience like a nail. 624 consecutive Sunday mornings, where I, the pastor of that congregation, passed him by with my leather Bible under my arm and my sermon outline in hand, in a hurry to speak of a love I did not practice with the man guarding my door. The weight of that number, 624, was suffocating. I knew his name. I knew his story because he told me several times with a patience I didn't deserve. He told me about the horrors he saw in Vietnam, about how he lost his family in a succession of tragedies, and about the shelter that closed its doors, leaving him at the mercy of the cold and the asphalt. He shared with me his chronic physical pains, the wounds that wouldn't heal, and the loneliness that corroded his spirit. And every single time, without exception, I passed right by him with an indifference I had learned to call focus on ministry. I was the man who went up to the altar to cry out for divine mercy over the city, while the very face of human need was sitting a few meters from my pulpit, waiting for a gesture that never came from my part. I felt important, anointed, and chosen, but before Jesus, I realized that I was just a hypocrite who used religion as a smokescreen to hide the hardness of my heart of stone, totally incapable of seeing the Christ who suffered in Marcus's wheelchair every Sunday. Memories began to flood my mind with agonizing precision. I saw every encounter, every exchange of words, every look from Marcus. He was always polite, always respectful, never demanding anything, only asking in that raspy voice, "God bless you, Pastor. Could you help me with something today?" And my responses, which at the time seemed so appropriate and spiritual, now sounded like pure blasphemy in my ears. "Sorry, Marcus, I'm late for the service." Or, "We prayed for you this week, Marcus." And the classic, "God will provide, Marcus. Have you tried that mission on 5th Street? Empty words, canned religious phrases, spiritual platitudes that cost nothing and solve nothing. I offered prayers as if they were bargaining chips to relieve my guilt, while my hands remained closed inside my pockets. I had time to prepare 1-hour sermons, but I didn't have 5 minutes to listen to the pain of a man who needed practical help. I had resources to renovate the auditorium, but I didn't have the courage to take Marcus to eat a hot plate of food or help him find a dignified place to sleep, preferring to leave him out in the open while I preached about heaven. The vision showed me the cruel contrast of my life. That same year, I had bought a new truck for $60,000. I ate at expensive restaurants twice a week and spent $3,000 on a family vacation trip to the beach. I even bought a new drum set for the worship team that cost $4,000, all in the name of excellence for the kingdom. But I couldn't give Marcus enough money for a decent meal. I couldn't buy a winter coat to protect him from the Tennessee frost. And I never moved a finger to connect him to the vast resources our church boasted. "You prayed for the poor every Sunday, Silas," Jesus continued, "and every word was a live coal. You organized fundraisers for missions in Africa. You sent $23,000 for a well in Uganda. Good things, important things. But Marcus was there every week at your door. And you stepped over him spiritually while you ran inside to preach about my love. The shame was a flame consuming me from within. I had failed the most basic test of the gospel, turning faith into an ego spectacle, while Jesus himself, hungry and naked in the person of Marcus, was ignored by me. "Then I am condemned," I whispered with a shattered soul, feeling the weight of each of those 624 Sundays of indifference fall on me like a mountain. 23 years of ministry, thousands of hours of study, sermons that moved crowds, and books that inspired thousands. All of it now seemed like ash and smoke before that single act of deliberate omission. I realized that my faithfulness was selective, and that I had built a God in my own image and likeness, a God who was content with rituals and ignored human misery. The agony of knowing that I was lost, not because of a great vice or a terrible crime, but because of a lack of practical love, was more painful than any fire I could imagine. I looked at Jesus, waiting for the final sentence, the decree of eternal separation that I now knew I deserved. But instead of condemnation, I saw something that broke me even more, a deep hope, and a purpose that I was not able to understand amidst my absolute despair and shame. "No," he said, and there was an authority in his voice that seemed to reorganize the atoms of my being, bringing a light I didn't think I would see again. "You are seeing the truth now, Silas, and seeing is the first step to truly living in my kingdom. I am giving you a second chance, not because your ministerial resume has any value or because you deserve extra credit, but because I want to use your failure to wake up others who are sleeping the same sleep as you." He approached and explained that millions of Christians are exactly where I was, preaching while ignoring, worshiping while passing right by the afflicted, serving church programs while neglecting flesh and blood people. Someone needed to warn them. Someone who understood the depth of this religious deception from the inside. Someone who could smell the altar and the asphalt simultaneously. "Go back," he ordered with an urgency that vibrated in every fiber of my consciousness. "Tell everything. Hide nothing. Find Marcus and change your life once and for all." And then, as if someone had flipped a switch from total darkness to a blinding and unbearable light, I was yanked from that dimension and thrown back into my body. The first thing I felt was pain, a searing agony that seemed to burn my chest, my throat, and every nerve I possessed. The absolute silence was replaced by a cacophony of machines beeping frantically and voices shouting medical terms I could barely process. "Dr. Whitmore, can you hear me?" someone shouted near my ear. "Squeeze my hand if you understand me." I tried to breathe, but I felt the tube in my throat and the sensation of being brought back from the depths of the ocean. It was a brutal transition, the weight of the flesh crushing me again. But Jesus' words still echoed louder than any hospital alarm. Tell everything. I was no longer the same man who had collapsed in that pulpit. The Silas who lived for the applause of the congregation had died in those 14 minutes of void. I opened my eyes slowly in the cardiac intensive care unit, surrounded by equipment monitoring every unstable beat of my patched heart. Veronica was there, holding my hand with a strength I had never felt, her eyes red and her face marked by suffering she couldn't hide. She was sobbing in a way that made me realize the gravity of what had happened on the physical plane while I was before the throne. "You were gone, Silas," she said through tears, her voice choked with shock. 14 whole minutes. The doctors said there was no more chance, that brain death was certain and that your heart would not come back. She told me the medical team was already about to declare the time of death when, inexplicably, my heart gave a jolt and started beating again. I looked at the hospital ceiling and knew, with a clarity that terrified me and freed me at the same time, that every beat I felt now was a loan from God, so that I could fulfill the mission of destroying empty religiosity. For 2 whole days, while the machines around me maintained the artificial rhythm of my survival, I told Veronica and my children every detail of what I witnessed. It was not an easy conversation. It was a confession watered with tears of repentance that I never imagined I would shed before my own family. I described the fire in Jesus' eyes, the void that swallowed the religious, and especially Marcus Dalton's face. I confessed about my years of studied indifference, about how I had turned the gospel into a comfort product that cost me nothing more than a few hours of weekly study. Veronica cried with me, squeezing my hand as if she were meeting me anew. She admitted softly that she also felt something was missing, that our life was a beautiful commercial for Christian faith, but that it rarely reflected the practical love Jesus demanded. That ICU became an altar of truth where the facade of the perfect pastor's family was torn down to make room for broken human beings desperately in need of a mercy that went beyond words. Physical recovery was slow and painful, but the urgency burning in my soul was much stronger than the weakness of my muscles. Every step I took in the hospital hallway felt like a rehearsal for the walk I needed to make to the encounter with my redemption on earth. I could no longer look at my private hospital room, at the flowers sent by church members, or at the messages of support on my cell phone without feeling a lump in my throat. All I saw was the contrast between my comfortable security and the abandonment of those I had ignored for 12 years. I knew that my first action outside that hospital would not be to return to the pulpit or to my air-conditioned office. I didn't need more board meetings or strategic plans for the next fiscal year of the church. I needed to find Marcus. That was the only thing that mattered. The only command I had to fulfill if I wanted to prove that those 14 minutes of death had not been just a lucid dream, but the definitive call to a real conversion. As soon as I was discharged, against medical protests calling for absolute rest, I began the search. It took 3 days of relentless searching through Nashville, traversing alleys, street corners, and community centers I had never set foot in before in 2 decades of living there. The city I thought I knew revealed itself as a labyrinth of invisible faces, and every homeless person I saw seemed like a mirror of my failure. Finally, I located Marcus in an overcrowded shelter across town, a place smelling of cheap disinfectant, sweat, and despair. He was there, sitting in his wheelchair in a dark corner of the cafeteria, looking even more fragile and shrunken than I remembered on Sunday mornings. The sound of metal trays clattering and the murmur of tired voices created a chaotic soundtrack for the moment I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind. My heart, which still beat with difficulty, accelerated in a way that scared me, but I knew I couldn't back down. I was no longer the influential pastor in search of a stray member. I was a sinner in search of forgiveness from someone I had treated as scenery. I approached him and knelt on the dirty floor of the shelter, ignoring the pain and the stitches of my recent surgery. "Marcus," I said, and my voice failed right at the start. He turned slowly, and those tired eyes took a few seconds to recognize me outside the context of the suit and the church entrance. "Pastor Silas?" he asked. with a genuine surprise that cut me like a knife. I held his hands, which were rough and cold, and began to speak without filters. I asked for forgiveness for the 624 times I passed him, as if he didn't exist. I confessed that I had failed him, and above all, that I had failed Jesus. I cried right there, in front of all those strangers, asking him to give me the chance to do the right thing. Marcus remained silent for a long time, looking at our joined hands, and then tears began to roll down his weathered face. "Pastor," he whispered with a sweetness I didn't deserve, "I prayed for you on every one of those Sundays. I asked that God would open your eyes someday, because I knew you were a good man, but you were blinded by your own brightness. I never stopped believing that this day would come. Today, a year and 2 months have passed since that meeting at the shelter, and I can say that nothing in my life or our church has remained the same. The first big impact was the radical decision to stop our luxurious building expansion project, which would have cost millions, to redirect every cent to what really mattered for the kingdom. We canceled the construction of the new air-conditioned sanctuary and used the $2 million from the reserve fund to create a direct assistance program for people in extreme crisis in our city. It wasn't an easy change. I lost influential members who preferred the comfort of upholstered pews to the dirt of a street ministry. But those who stayed had their hearts set on fire by the same truth that rescued me on the operating table. We transformed underutilized classrooms into a free clinic and opened transition houses for those who, like Marcus, had been forgotten by the system and by us. We stopped investing in giant LED screens and started investing in human beings, realizing that the true temple is not made of bricks, but of restored lives. Marcus lives today in a small but dignified apartment that our church acquired to serve as permanent housing. He is no longer a project or an assistance case. He is my brother, my friend, and one of the most respected advisors in our community. Seeing Marcus sitting in the front row, no longer in a rusty wheelchair but in clean clothes, receiving the medical treatment he needed for his chronic pains, is the most powerful sermon I have ever preached. He regained his dignity, his health stabilized, and he became the bridge between the church and the invisible people of our city, who previously didn't have the courage to cross our doors. Many times, when fatigue tries to overcome me, or when the old temptation of pastoral pride knocks at the door, I look at him and remember the 14 minutes I was dead and the void that almost swallowed me. Marcus is the living reminder of my second chance, the physical proof that God's love is not a theological concept to be discussed in seminars, but a practical action that takes someone off the sidewalk and places them in a safe home. Our measure of success changed drastically. We stopped counting how many people filled the auditorium and started measuring how many lives were being truly transformed and integrated into society. Instead of hiring more sound technicians or marketing directors, we hired social workers and mental health specialists to work full-time with us. Sunday stopped being a spectacle of religious entertainment and became a center for the distribution of hope and social justice. The atmosphere of the church changed. The smell of expensive perfumes now mixes with the smell of people who just came off the streets in search of a new beginning and acceptance. Many felt uncomfortable with this new reality, claiming the church was losing its spiritual identity. But I respond with the same conviction Jesus gave me. The spirituality that does not translate into compassion is just a well-dressed corpse. We discovered that God's true presence is not felt in collective goosebumps during an emotional chorus, but in the look of gratitude from someone who discovered they are no longer alone. Now, as you read these words, I ask you a favor. Close your eyes for a second and examine your heart with brutal honesty. Whose face appeared in your mind while I narrated my failure? We all have a Marcus in our lives, that person we see regularly, but whom we train our eyes not to see for convenience. It could be the coworker sinking into debt and depression, the elderly neighbor living in absolute isolation, or that man holding a sign at the traffic light you pass every day. You have the resources, you have the ability, and right now, you have the opportunity to act differently than I acted for 12 years. The question Jesus will ask you on the great day will not be about your attendance at services or your deep knowledge of doctrines. He will ask, "When I was hungry, thirsty, or naked, what did you do?" The answer to that question determines where you will spend eternity. For faith that does not produce real and tangible action is a dangerous illusion. Faith without works is not just a biblical phrase to be discussed in theological debates. It is a spiritual reality that determines the weight of our soul on the scale of eternity. I spent decades believing my salvation was sealed by my confession of faith and my prominent position in the pulpit. But the truth is that I was building a sandcastle on the base of my own indifference. Every sermon I preached without having my hands dirty from real service to others was a lie I told myself and my congregation. We get used to the varnish of religion very easily, to the smell of incense and the harmonious sound of the piano, and we end up forgetting that the gospel smells of open wounds and bread broken at the table of need. If your faith does not bother you, if it does not take you out of your comfort zone and force you to look into the eyes of those who suffer, it simply is not the faith of Jesus. It is just a comfortable philosophy of life that gives you a false sense of security while you walk, with long strides, toward an abyss of a mission that could cost you everything you prize. Understand that the danger of religious performance is that it is extremely convincing, both for those who see it and those who execute it. I was the first to believe in my own holiness, because I followed all the etiquette rules of a good Christian. I didn't cheat on my wife, I didn't steal, I didn't lie grossly, and I was at church whenever the doors opened for service. But Jesus didn't show me my sins of commission. He showed me the bottomless pit of my sins of omission. What condemns us before the throne is not just the evil we actively practice, but the good that, having the full power to do, we decide to ignore for convenience. The cost of our spiritual comfort is too high, and the final price is paid in souls that are lost while we discuss what the best lighting for the stage is or what the next worship trend is. We need to stop treating the church like an entertainment club and go back to being the field hospital that Christ planned. True worship happens when you step down from your pedestal of self-righteousness and become the answer to the prayer of someone who no longer has strength. Time is running out in a way that most of us refuse to admit in our daily lives. I had 14 minutes of clinical death to realize that life is a breath, and that every opportunity to demonstrate practical love is a test of fire for our salvation. Those 624 times I passed Marcus were not just scheduling failures or ministerial haste. They were 624 deliberate refusals to serve God Himself incarnated in that need. Each of those Sunday mornings was a chance I threw in the trash in the name of a religion that required nothing of me but beautiful and well-articulated words. Don't wait to have a cardiac arrest or a traumatic near-death experience to wake up to the reality of what it truly means to follow Christ. The call is for now, for the person sitting next to you on the bus, for the employee you barely greet, or for the relative you struck from your life. The urgency of the kingdom is not in big events, but in the small gestures of compassion that no one sees, except the one who searches the intentions. I feel that although my physical body has returned to this world, a vital part of me remained forever in that space of light and consuming fire. There is a permanent and deep mark on my conscience, a type of soul memory that physically prevents me from returning to being the man I was before that surgery. I can no longer hear a worship hymn without thinking about the hunger of those outside our walls, and I cannot read the Bible without feeling the weight of the practical responsibility of every verse. It is a total inability to logically explain how my decades of theology were pulverized in seconds by the simple image of a man in a wheelchair. I feel constant chills when I enter luxurious temples and realize how far we are from the simple heart of Jesus. This mark is not a common physical scar, although the one on my chest reminds me daily of the price of my stubbornness, but it is a constant haunting that makes me tremble before the holiness of God and the seriousness of what He expects of us as His true followers. My name is Silas Whitmore. I am 51 years old. I live in Nashville, and I died for 14 minutes to discover that 23 years of ministry were worth almost nothing before the throne. I am not here to scare you with horror stories about hell, but to tell you the truth about the danger of spending your entire life inside a church and still losing your soul because of a hardened and selective heart. The sin that Jesus showed me was not something I did in secret, but what I refused to do in the light of day. To love my neighbor in a practical, sacrificial, and real way. The illusion that we are saved just by knowing correct doctrine or by leading influential congregations is the biggest trap Satan has planted in modern Christian circles. If your faith does not move your hands to service and your pocket to generosity, it is a dead faith, an empty shell that will have no weight when you are alone before the consuming fire that sees everything on the great day. Stop just talking about love and start demonstrating it right now, before the timer of your life reaches the end without prior notice. The person right in front of you today, the one you usually ignore or silently judge, is your final test of faithfulness to the kingdom. Don't wait for the next missions campaign or the next charity event from your church to do what the Holy Spirit is already prompting you to do now. How you respond to the needs of others determines your eternal destiny, and there is no theology or rhetoric that can change this absolute spiritual reality. Faith without works is dead. Fé sem obras é cadáver religioso. Jesus sent me back to tell you that the time for theological excuses is over. Either your Christianity is practical and visible in the life of someone who has nothing to offer you in return, or it is nothing more than a theatrical performance that does not have heaven's seal of approval. Help today, because tomorrow is a luxury that no one is guaranteed. The experience left me with an open wound in my soul that time cannot close, a conscience so sharp that silence sometimes hurts. I live in a state of constant vigil, where every face that crosses my path seems to carry a spark of that divinity I saw in the void. I can no longer logically explain how a man can be completely transformed in just 14 minutes of absolute silence and documented brain death. For science, I was a medical miracle of resuscitation. For me, I was a reprobate who received a clemency that defies human reason. The world keeps spinning, people keep chasing their ambitions, and the church continues with its rituals. But for me, all of this has become transparent and almost irrelevant in the face of the urgency to serve. I feel like I am just passing through, a stranger in my own home carrying a secret that weighs more than my own physical body, a mark of fire that constantly reminds me that the spiritual is real. And suddenly, just as it began on that hospital ceiling, the vision and absolute clarity of that other side seemed to withdraw to a deep place within me, leaving me only with the unstable beating of my patched heart. There are no more words to describe the indescribable, nor arguments to convince those who prefer to keep sleeping. The experience simply ceased, leaving only the void of doubt in others and the devastating certainty in me. I said what needed to be said, and fulfilled the order I received in that dimension of terror and glory. What you do with this account now is strictly your choice, a weight you will have to carry before the same throne where I stood. The light from my computer monitor reflects on my tired face, and the silence of the night in Nashville surrounds me like a frigid blanket, reminding me that my time here is short, and every second counts for eternity. There is nothing more I can add. My breath is alone and my mission has been fulfilled.
Is your faith a practice of love, or just a religious mask? If this account impacted you in any way, share your experience or opinion in the comments below. Your interaction is fundamental for us. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. This is essential so you don't miss the next transformative contents we will bring. Now, click on the recommended video that appears on your screen to continue this journey of reflection.